Excellent. Right. So I'll just do a very brief introduction to Michael, and then I'll let him take over. So Michael's a senior lecturer in the history of science at the University of Edinburgh, and he's going to talk to us around issues to do with kind of curriculum design, really. And I think it's particularly interesting to hear from Michael because for two reasons. One, because he recently won a prize from the Royal Historical Society for his teaching activities. So he's an award-winning teacher in higher education. So that's great. And secondly, I think interestingly, he's a historian, but he isn't situated in a history department. So he's kind of engaging with teaching history outside of history. How do you kind of cross those kind of boundaries that sometimes exist kind of administratively within universities? And I'm going to shut up. It's much more interesting to hear what Michael has to say. So I'll hand over to him now.
Great. Thanks so much, Jamie. This is a real pleasure to have a chance to talk with this group. And I know how much work goes on behind the scenes to bring something like this together. And it's a really tremendous resource. I really enjoyed yesterday's sessions, and hope we can keep things moving and keep things interesting. As Jamie mentioned, I'm a historian of science, and I'm in a social science department rather than a history department. And history of science is kind of a weird field in that very few of the people in history of science come out of an undergraduate history background. So I think we did a tally in my department among historians of science, and there were, I think, something like a dozen different first degrees that we had going into the field, none of which was history. The first introductory history class I was involved in was the one that I had to design from scratch and teach as a postgraduate student. So I'm coming to this field and this sort of question of how you design a module and how you think about teaching in history with a little bit of a different perspective that I think has helped to ask a couple different kinds of questions that hopefully will be useful to you, whether you're teaching in a history department or not, and whether your students are primarily history students or not. So those are the kinds of questions and the kinds of contexts that I want to ask about. I just want to flag this image here. I don't have a lot of illustrations for this, but I think this is a really cool image. This is one of the earliest iconographic depictions of teaching at a blackboard. So as someone who started in mathematics, blackboards have a special place in my pedagogical heart. And I think the history of blackboards tells us a lot about the changing contexts and technologies and modes and expectations of education. And I think it really bears in mind, we think of blackboards as this like very science-oriented, formal, deductive kind of medium. But blackboards for hundreds of years before they were ever associated with mathematics were tools of choral training, of teaching people in religious settings to sing together. And I really love that idea of educational technologies being oriented around what you need to be able to join together in some kind of harmonious devotional activity. So that's kind of my framing idea for this presentation. I want to start with a warm-up question. As we did yesterday, just throw your answers in the chat whenever you like to. So our warm-up question, which will draw on some of the ideas, hopefully, that you were still thinking about from yesterday, is what are history modules for? And I want to frame this by saying one of the slogans that I always tell my students is, in university settings, there are no trick questions. They're questions designed to make you think of the wrong answer. But there are surprisingly interesting questions. So questions where the answer is not necessarily as you expect, and understanding the complexity of the question and the richness behind the question is part of what we're here for. So some kinds of surprisingly interesting questions I asked in my intro history of science question, intro history of science module are things like, what time is it? Or how can you measure a fart? All sorts of just questions that get you thinking and try to explore the big issues raised in history education. So go ahead and put in the chat some of your ideas from yesterday or from your own experience about what history modules are for. So we have a contribution, understanding a theme. Probably the theme is in the title of the module, so that's a good guide when you're trying to understand that. There's a balance of understanding larger concepts and also understanding specific times and places, and that's a real tension in module design that's going to be a constant theme as you're working on your own modules. Teaching independent learning and critical thinking. So one thing we're definitely going to focus on in the next 20 minutes or so is how that can be a very different question for different learners with different backgrounds and needs. Exposing students to unfamiliar periods, teaching particular skills, Lots of great answers so far. So keep those coming. I'm going to give some answers of my own. So there are two basic models of module design that are reflected in Jamie's design for yesterday and today's sessions. So there's an idea of a module consisting of lectures and discussions and readings and assessments, the things that students do or the ways you interact with students. There's another principle that was, I think, even it was especially on display in the first presentation yesterday about modules consisting of concepts and knowledge and skills and needs and goals. And that's what you really emphasized in your answers in the chat here. I think it's also important to recognize that there are two different contexts of module design. So first, there's the context and the discipline. We teach history modules. So whether or not we're in a history department, we are inducting our students into the field of history, into a methodology, into a way of thinking, also very much reflected in your answers in the chat. But modules also are components of degrees, of curriculums, of universities. Often history modules are taught within an expected pathway for training someone to be a history graduate. But often history modules are taught in other settings. So when I'm teaching students, history students are probably the largest single cohort of my students, but they're a small minority of the class. My students come from, they did a tally recently, over 100 different degree programs in the university. And so thinking about where a history of science module sits within the education of an engineer and an artist and a physician and a geographer, as well as a historian, and how those can intersect in really fruitful ways is something that can really benefit a module design. So our goal here is to think about how these all fit together, what kinds of questions you have to ask in order to see how they fit together. And really importantly, we want them to fit together in a way that your department and your university and your discipline will value and recognize. So it was a real honor to have some of this some of my own work on this recognized by the Royal Historical Society recently, as Jamie mentioned. And you really want to think about what how not just your students, but your colleagues and your discipline and your university are going to value what you're going to do. Because ultimately, when you're teaching and when you're designing modules, you're doing it as part of a career, you're doing it as part of a profession, and these are really important aspects of how you should approach designing a module. So we'll ask over the next 20 minutes or so, what is a module about? Whom is the module for? How will students complete the module? And what I'm going to do is ask a lot of questions relatively quickly, with not a lot of time to reflect and soak it in. But the idea, as Jamie mentioned, is that there are recordings and slides available afterward. And I want to sort of show you a lot of questions, get you to start thinking about them. And then you have the opportunity as you're going on into whatever kind of module design you're doing at this point in your career or later on to revisit the ideas or the questions that are useful for you. And this kind of approach to lecturing, I think you'll recognize from the discussion yesterday, one of many possible ones, which is based on the idea that we'll discuss that often when you are teaching mixed audiences with lots of different needs, there will only be or certain parts of your presentation or certain parts of your lessons will be more or less useful to different students of yours. And creating a structure and being explicit about that structure for how different students with different needs can take what they need from your presentation is a really useful thing to have in mind when you're designing not just lectures, but entire modules. So here's our next surprisingly interesting question. What is your module about? So we had already this idea from our last question that often your module has a title. Sometimes you get to choose that title. So that's our kind of sort of first level answer for what the module is about. But for something that you're preparing to teach now or that you've taught recently or that you would like to teach in the future, what are some examples of ways of answering this question? What is your module about? Go ahead and put those in the chat. So there's one on turning points in Welsh history, one about a module being about how to write history and how to write in an academic setting more generally. In some universities, an intro history module is the kind of gateway for a lot of students into scholarly writing, which is a great setting and great goal. Digital history as a methodology. We have some more thematic topics, some more periodization, some contexts. So these are all some really great examples. Just let people soak those in as we go. So here are some questions that I think are useful to ask when you're thinking about what a module is about. So we've have some examples here about this really gateway question: what topics is the module sort of supposed to be about? And then within that, what specific topics need to be covered for this to be a credible module in your field? So when I'm teaching an introduction to the history of science, I know for this to be a credible introductory course, I'm going to need the students to learn about the scientific revolution, about heliocentrism, about evolution as a scientific concept, which is one that's very relevant to their lives and their political and social and cultural participation after the course. Concepts like atomism, relativity, these are things that must be in the module one way or another. And that's a really good starting point for thinking about module design, is knowing within the context of your field what students really have to see in order for it to be credible. And often it's useful to think about that specifically in terms of how this compares to the number of weeks in the calendar, because often the initial phase of module design is just taking everything students need to have exposure to and seeing how they fit in the different weeks you have available to you. Paired to this, and already reflected in some other of the responses in the chat, is what should students be able to do? What skills or what approaches to contextualization or analysis should students ideally have by the end? But you also need to think about a spectrum of outcomes for the course. So I think for a lot of us, the default is to think about teaching what we were like as students, and because we are people who have gone on to careers that involve teaching history, we're probably pretty unrepresentative of most of the students that we'll have. So we do want to definitely make a course that we would have wanted to take when we were at the appropriate level for that course. But we also need the course to speak to students who have different approaches, different needs, different backgrounds that they want to derive from the course. And thinking about a spectrum from what you think absolutely every student, if they're going to get a passing mark, needs to be able to demonstrate and do, and all the way up to what our kind of ideal typical student and also what our ideal exceptional student might want to get to from the course, or what we would hope for them to be able to achieve, is important for thinking about what the module is about. So you think about how those skills and perspectives are developed across the module. That was a big theme yesterday, and you'll have some more discussion of that in later sessions today. But also thinking about what you are excited to teach and what they're going to be excited to learn. Where is the energy, where is the interest in the module coming from? Every course has a narrative, whether you design it intentionally to have one or not. So it's very important in module design to make your narrative obvious and intentional, and to make that narrative clear to students. So talk with the students at the beginning of the course and as you're going, or in the beginning of the module. I'm using that in our university, we call them courses, more the American terminology. As you go through the module, making clear to students how the narrative is shaping up and fitting together. So in history teaching, and I have history of science front of mind, and this will apply to a lot of history teaching, there are a lot of kind of default narratives that you'll see. So there's the chronological structure of the course. In intro history of science, we call this the Plato to NATO syllabus, where you have some linear version of the history. That's a structure of course design that can work really well. It can give students something to latch onto, but it's also one that's received a lot of criticism, a lot of well-justified criticism in the field, as perhaps too readily embracing meta-narratives of progress and of a sort of unidirectional march of science. So that's something to be wary of and mindful of, or the version of that applies to the field that you're teaching. There are thematic organizations, conceptual organizations. You can also organize a course historiographically, and this is a popular way to do things in more advanced courses, where you talk about the history of how historians have studied a subject. Start with some classic texts, look at ways that it's been challenged over time. And that has its own challenges associated with it in terms of how you make things perspicuous, what kinds of backgrounds and perspectives students are expected to know in order to be able to make sense of that historiographical progression. It's important not to assume that students have the kind of broad view of how the understanding of a topic has fit together that you are using to base your understanding of historiographical starting points and complications. And the real risk there is if students don't have that context, they might take your starting point for the course as the sort of controlling narrative and see that as the kind of right answer that then has all of these variations, rather than seeing that as something that's been superseded by subsequent historiography. And then thinking from a sort of more middle level in terms of course design, as you're assembling your topics and your skills and your concepts into a sequence, thinking about what depends on what other aspects of the course in order to make sense to the material. So early in my Intro History of Science course, there's a sequence of units going from the theme of abstractions, where we talk about sort of features of society like accounting and record keeping, and also sort of techniques of scholarship, like assembling things into books and doing critical exegesis of a source. And that provides the foundation for the next week when we talk about collections in natural history and in botany and zoology and geology and other sciences that are based on assemblages of large materials, which builds on this idea that there are different ways of organizing and presenting information and analyzing it critically. And that provides the foundation for a lot of different concepts that are necessary to understand the history of the life sciences, as developing specific kinds of abstractions out of particular kinds of collections of living things. So there's a kind of conceptual sequence that builds from one week to the next, and making that explicit to students is really important for them to be able to draw connections across the course. I've alluded to, I'll just sort of underscore, there's a relation between history and historiography that you are familiar with as scholars of history. And that's related to the relationship between history teaching and making explicit the historiographical ideas and principles reflected in your course design. And how explicit that is, and how much of the historiography you bring into your history teaching will really depend on the level and the goals of the course. But one thing that we do in Edinburgh that I think has been really effective, that you may have the opportunity to do, is combine teaching at different levels in a way that that really develops this dialogue explicitly. So in my history of science teaching, I have one group of students who are first and second year undergraduates, and I have one group of students who are first and second year postgraduates, and they go through the same sequence at the same time. And with the undergraduates, we're doing the history lesson, and with the postgraduates, we're talking about all of the historiography and all of the debates about interpretation and presentation that go into that undergraduate unit as a way of learning the historiography, but also as a way of thinking about teaching methodology. So our next question, and you can start typing in the chat already, is whom is your module for? I've already mentioned in my case, I have to think about students from basically every sector of the university. And it's a kind of unusual course, both in my university and I think in the way higher education tends to be structured in the UK in general. But it's really good to be aware of who potentially takes your module and who tends to be your students. So already a wide range, just in the first two answers, of the kinds of fields and disciplines that are relevant to the course. This idea of majors and minors. So is the history the core topic, or is it something that is expanding on what the student's core topic is? There's an idea of practice-based versus other uses and goals of the course. So it's already a really good range to be thinking about from answers to this. So this first question, who are your students, is a really important gateway to module design. So as discussed yesterday, you're thinking about what do your students know, what can they already do, but also what do they need to know and what do they need to do. So whether it's developing specific writing skills, whether it's learning the appropriate ways to read historical texts, whether they need to know specific historical context. How important is it really that students know the key sequence of events from 1789 to 1792 in the French Revolution? Is that of methodological interest? Sorry, I need to take the squeaky toy away from the dog. is that a primarily methodological interest, or is there a purpose in where they're going after your course, where they need to have those facts in a really good order and narrative, because that affects what information you give students and how you present it, and also how you examine it and assess it, which is something that I know you're going to be talking about later today. You also have to think about what obstacles might affect your students' activity and engagement. So are your students older or younger? What students come to your university more generally? What obstacles might they face? We are in an important stage of a cost of living crisis that's affecting students very directly, as well as affecting staff. Students may be having to work in order to meet their subsistence needs. That's going to affect how they're able to approach your teaching. They may have family situations that affect how they can engage with your course, what background and preparation they have with their course. And the really important principle underlying this is that universities are very strong mechanisms. They can be mechanisms of social mobility and social change, but they also tend to be, especially by default, mechanisms of ramifying inequality. So the students you design for will be better able to succeed. And because of all of the kinds of regulatory and assessment and standardization mechanisms, especially strongly felt in the UK, there's a way of making that kind of advantage of being the students you have in mind, being the students you design for, look like the result of student merit or an achievement rather than your design decisions. So you have to be very careful about knowing how the effects of your design decisions will play out for students from different backgrounds and different situations, and how that relates to broader questions about justice and inequality in universities and in our wider societies. Students will be part of programs and curricula, and programs and curricula are part of the place that your module will have in a university. So you have to think about, do your students have to be there? Is it a mandatory course? Is it an elective? What kind of elective is it? If it is an elective? Is convincing students to sign up a challenge that you're going to have? Is convincing students to stay a challenge that's going to be relevant to you? Because this will affect what you present, when and how, and what you can take for granted about students' different forms of engagement. And you also have to think about whether the module is a priority for students and whether it should be. So one thing that was very hard for me to take on board when I was starting as a history teacher is that it's okay for a module not to be your student's top priority. So I came through my education really feeling like I should put my all into especially modules in my subjects of special interest, including history of science. And initially I was a little disappointed when students weren't as excited or didn't give as high a priority to the subject as I did. But I think in the broader ecosystem of the university and of students' education, there's a lot of value to courses that they can relax in, that they can reset in, that can be a break from a really challenging laboratory class that they have, or a really challenging methodology or writing class that they have. And courses that are flexible, and even courses that they can safely skip for a couple of weeks and come back to and revisit, have a really valuable place in the curriculum, and one whose value I think is under-recognized. But can be part of how you design a course, if that's or a module, if that's an appropriate format for yours. And really taking pride in being a class that students want to come to anyway, even if it's not something that has an axe hanging over them that they have to do well. That's also something to take pride in, and something that you can really contribute a lot of value to for your students and your university. And just to say a couple words about teaching multidisciplinary groups in this context, I think one of the defining challenges for my own teaching in history of science has been the many different kinds of considerations that come from teaching multidisciplinary groups. So not being able to take for granted that students know how to write an essay or are comfortable writing an essay, are comfortable reading more than a couple pages, know how to approach those kinds of topics in a way that's going to be useful for the course, but also having students who are very comfortable writing essays, who are already starting to do a little bit of historical research, who know what a primary source is and how to start reading it, and getting students to be able to talk to each other, to develop those skills in each other, and to develop these kinds of critical perspectives on the knowledge they have and the knowledge they want is really valuable. But then I also have to think about things like our university is built into the city. It has a fairly wide geography. Students may have to travel up to 2 or 3 miles from where they're normally based for most of their modules in order to get to lectures and discussions for mine. So how that travel time factors into their ability to take the course, how we schedule things, maybe starting the first 15 or 20 minutes of a lecture with material that students can catch up on in a video recording later, if they're not able to make it for the initial part of the discussion, and building that into the design of the course so students aren't disadvantaged for the disciplinary background or the or just the physical location of the department they're coming from. All of these things affect aspects of how the course is structured, how we place different kinds of skills at different points in the course so that students are prepared for what they need from the background that they're having. And then also I'll talk about in a minute or two, a really important thing when you have students with so many different kinds of backgrounds and needs in your course, it's especially important to focus early and often on having students articulate their own goals and needs as part of your module, and making it clear how students should adapt their approach to the module for where they're coming from and what they need, because that's not the kind of customization that you're going to be able to do explicitly and directly for every single student. I think it's also, when you're talking about who the course is for, you also have to think about people who are not your students. So if you're teaching in a team, who are you teaching with? What kinds of relationships of collaboration, mentoring, and teamwork are going to be valuable and energizing and productive for the team you're teaching on, what your role in the team is, whether you're the module organizer or whether you're contributing a couple lectures or whether you're running tutorials. These are all considerations that go into the course design. It's also becoming, I think, increasingly the case that in UK higher education, of thinking of students themselves as kinds of peer teachers, and what kinds of peer pedagogical skills you can develop in students, and how that can be a part of your approach to education there. You have to think about your interaction with people in supporting roles in administration, in making the technical facilities available to you work as they should, assignment submission, moving students around between tutorial groups, all of those things that are technically and infrastructurally necessary, and also your relationship to the kinds of oversight mechanisms that are part of your university and part of the discipline, external examiners, moderation, how that works in your department, all are factors that affect how you can design courses and what options are available to you. And within and related to that, you also have to bear in mind the larger considerations of working in the university. So you'll all be familiar with the extended period of industrial dispute that university staff have been engaged in over the last several years over questions like workloads and working conditions, the institutional constraints that affect what we can teach and how we can teach it. And these are absolutely relevant to module design. You're not going to have the most successful module you can if you go into it with the assumption that your teaching team has an infinite amount of time available to it to adapt to students, that your students have the kinds of conditions and support that are optimal for their learning. You have to be realistic about what position your university has placed both you and your students in order to be able to make the most of what you're doing. And finally, within this section, it's really important to pay attention to what's in the course for you. So what's going to make the course exciting and rewarding for you to teach, and how the course fits within your own professional development, your career milestones, what you're going to need to be able to demonstrate for whatever's coming next in your career that you've done in teaching, and make that a part of the design of your course. Use that as an excuse or an opportunity to try different things, different teaching techniques, different methodologies, because those are going to make the course more rewarding for you to teach, more enjoyable for you to teach, but also more useful for your career. So a final section, which we'll do quite quickly, starting with a surprisingly interesting question. How did you learn to read? And I'll just take a few seconds with this. And please just put your answers in the chat. I'm going to continue going through the kinds of questions that I think this raises, but I want you to see this as a question that opens up some really important pedagogical questions about teaching, and particularly teaching in history. So one of the core lessons that I try to give my students is you're constantly relearning to read and learning to read different things. So it's not like you learned how to make sounds out of letters as a child, and that was when your learning to reading stopped. When I transitioned from a mathematician to a historian as part of my postgraduate education, I felt like a lot of that was relearning how to read in a very different way. And I try to make explicit for my students that reading like a historian is a different kind of skill that they have to explicitly develop. And there are many different kinds of reading that you do as a historian. It's important to be explicit in your module design and then in your teaching and delivery, that there are different texts that are part of your reading list and that students will be engaging in different ways. And they have to think about them as different texts requiring different skills that they need to practice explicitly. You have to demonstrate what to focus on. You have to give students permission to come away with a partial understanding. I think a lot of students come into history courses with an expectation that every sentence that they read is something that they might be quizzed on or they might be responsible for knowing. And that's not how, as you know, as practicing historians, we tend to approach most texts that we read and that we engage with in our research, in our historiography, in our engagement with the discipline. And that's something that students need to be told and taught and shown. And part and parcel of that is figuring out what is interesting and relevant within your reading. And especially in multidisciplinary classrooms, making that sort of reading like a historian skill very explicit, and also getting biologists to think about how reading like a historian can help them as a biologist, getting engineers to think about how reading like a historian can help them as engineers is a really great way to make the course valuable to them. Scholarly writing is something you've talked a lot about. We're going to talk more about today. I'll just note some things that I found in my own teaching, that some skills that I tended to take for granted when I started teaching, I now definitely don't take for granted. That students will know how to paraphrase, how to take notes on a reading, how to cite their sources, how to identify what a paragraph or what a chapter or what a book is claiming. These are all things that, depending on the course or module, may need to be more or less explicitly part of your design and your plan for how to teach the course. I find a really important, especially in these multidisciplinary settings, as I've said, component of the design of the course is thinking about how to make students make the module into their own. So I sometimes think about my Intro History of Science module not as one course for hundreds of students, but as hundreds of different courses that all share some common nucleus of lectures and discussions and course materials. And getting students to develop this as hundreds of different courses, each of them customized to their own goals, their own needs, and something that they themselves should be constantly revisiting over the term, helps every student, whether they're engaging the course primarily as a way to relax or a flexible sort of background thing to their more important classes, or whether that's a core interest of theirs, helps them get the most about what they need from the course and how they're approaching it. You'll have seen this concept of metacognition, of sort of identifying the process of learning that students are going through. And this helps students learn more, but I think just as importantly, it helps students appreciate what they've learned and articulate what they've learned, including, and thinking about where this fits in your sort of career development, helping students be very explicit about evaluating themselves, about setting goals, gives them a much clearer idea of what they've taken away from the course that's reflected in their evaluations of your teaching, and their ability to articulate what they've learned in settings where you need them to have a clear idea of what they've come away with. I think incorporating self-assessment into my own courses, my own modules, has been one of the best aspects of assessment that I've been able to do. So getting students to evaluate their own work, to suggest their own mark even, and it doesn't mean you go with whatever mark the student suggests, but it tells you how the student interpreted the task, how they view their own work, whether they're going to be surprised or disappointed with the mark they actually get, and it lets you calibrate your feedback in a way that's going to be much more useful to them. You can maybe talk about in Q&A, since we're running a bit short on time, about how this relates to institutional rubrics. So often your institution will have a very fixed scale that they want you to use, and that is often not as prescriptive as it feels. So that's what I'll say about that. There's often much more flexibility in those than it would seem. I want to say about 60 seconds of words about what to do when students take shortcuts, because that can be a very frustrating and a very challenging thing to encounter, especially as someone who's relatively new to teaching. And there's a real tendency to blame the students for taking shortcuts, of seeing them as lazy or cheating or trying to somehow cheat the course. And I think one sort of mark of maturity in your course design and in your adaptation in teaching is to work on seeing student shortcuts as symptoms of problems with your course design. So in almost every case, and there are obviously exceptions, but in almost every case that I've encountered in my own and colleagues teaching, when you see surges of plagiarism or bad citation practice or bad writing practice, or what you might call the bootstrap essay, where students try to answer your essay question without really engaging the course materials that you provided them and the lessons you've given them. They're almost all cases where you haven't developed the narrative and the sequence and the skills of the course in the way that students need them to be developed in order to learn effectively. And just a last couple of ideas about designing resiliently. So thinking about, as we talked about earlier, how students are going to be able to derive value, gain benefit from your course when they haven't prepared for reasons that are virtuous or reasons that are excusable or reasons that are preposterous. Doesn't really matter. The students still have to come to the course and still have to learn something. What students can do when they miss a class, when they're bored, how they can challenge themselves within the bounds of your curriculum and your design. What you can do so the lesson works, if your lesson relies especially on discussion or on interaction or on group work, how to make that worthwhile when students have different levels and different kinds of preparation. And my sort of parting advice is the magic words for being able to have flexible coursework and particularly being able to accommodate a lot of different student needs within the kinds of regulatory and review frameworks that structure a lot of higher education here is portfolio assessment. So being able to say, we're going to ask students to submit a body of work that demonstrates what they've learned, but without necessarily having a fixed uniform set of essay questions or tasks that every student does in the same way, has been a lifesaver and a real liberating experience for teaching, if that's something that your department will let you get away with. So that's where I'll end, and we have a couple minutes for a discussion or questions or thoughts that you all have. I'll stop screen sharing now.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Michael. That was really interesting. Loads of like great ideas and ways around challenges that you face when you're trying to design a module and think about all the things that you have to think about. It's quite mind-bending when you're designing it, and then once you've kind of given it for the first time and then you're trying to develop it over time, it's really a never-ending process. Does anyone have any questions or comments? Please put them in the chat or speak up. Yeah, so
that's a good question. So am I saying that cheating, plagiarism is the teacher's fault? Almost always the teacher has some responsibility for it, and I think that's a really challenging perspective to take on as a teacher. So definitely the first few times that I in my own teaching, when I encountered students doing just doing lazy cribbing from Wikipedia, or not properly citing things, or incorporating text in a way that we frown upon in essays. It was really disappointing. It was kind of heartbreaking, and I took it kind of personally. But I think it was important in responding to that, in recognizing that there were shortcomings in my own design, where students were turning to those approaches because they were being asked to do things that they weren't prepared to do. They were being asked to demonstrate skills that they hadn't developed, and the assignment wasn't building on the actual learning that they were doing in the course in a way that they could be proud of and that they could succeed in. So I do think that it is important always to ask, when you're seeing cases of things that we tend to punish as dishonesty, as symptoms of course design, and can often be addressed with changes in the way you approach your course design. Yeah.
There's a couple of questions here, both about portfolio assessment, which are about is it difficult to assess? How,
yeah,
like implementation specific examples? So maybe just if you could talk around that for a minute, that would be great.
Yeah, definitely. So when I took over our intro history of science module, it was a kind of, I think, very stereotypical history assessment pattern of a short essay in the middle of the module and a long essay at the end of the module. And especially in that multidisciplinary setting, we're finding that students who were not coming from essay writing fields were really struggling with both essays, but especially the short essay early on. But also there weren't really enough opportunities during the 10 instructional weeks that we had to develop the kinds of essay writing skills that we were then examining them at the end. So what we were able to do is say, we want students to write a certain number of words, in my case, sort of 2,500 to 3,500 words, demonstrating what they've learned on the course. But there are lots of different ways they can do that, and we want them to be explicit about how they're choosing ways of demonstrating what they've learned that respond to what they did in the module in order to learn the material, in order to develop the skills, that demonstrate a variety of different skills, and that are really directly engaged with what they need from the course and where they're going with it. And what we found is that if you include that sort of level of explicit reflection, so within a self-assessment, within the self-evaluation, within students sort of explaining what they've done, it actually becomes a lot easier to mark, because you know what they're expecting, you know how they've engaged with it, you know how they relate what they've learned to the formal course expectations. And you can give much more targeted and effective feedback to what they need from the course, rather than guessing, just seeing how they've answered whatever one question you've set for them about 16th century France. Having them sort of take their own way into the material lets you be a lot more targeted in your marking, and have it be a lot more responsive to how they're approaching the course. Formally, what you do for your board of studies is you say, these are the outcomes we're evaluating, here's how it's structured, here are the parameters we're giving the students, here's an example of the kinds of things that they're going to be doing. And what I found is I think you can probably expect to encounter a little bit of skepticism, but generally, especially in the current climate in higher education, a lot of boards of studies will be willing to let you try. And being able to demonstrate that you're being rigorous and explicit and effective with that will let you keep on doing it after the first try or two. I don't know if that probably a partial answer, but hopefully helpful.
That's fantastic, Michael. There's one more question in the chat, which I think maybe you might be able to answer that in the chat itself while we move on to the next. That would be great. It's about what non-history students get out of doing history modules, which I think you're very well placed to talk about.